The rain hammered against the metal roof of the small clinic like 1,000 angry fists. Dr. Alan Reeves sat at his desk, staring at the half-empty bottle of whiskey he had promised himself he would not open tonight. Outside, Frontier Station 7 groaned under the force of the storm that had grounded every ship in the sector for the past 6 hours. The trading post was a forgotten piece of metal floating at the edge of colonized space, where people came to disappear or to profit from those who had nowhere else to go. Alan had chosen to disappear. 5 years since the War of Unification ended, and still the screams of his medical team echoed in his head during quiet moments. He had been too slow that day, too careful, too human. By the time he made his decisions, the blast had already torn through the field hospital. He survived because he had stepped away to grab more supplies. 12 doctors and nurses died because he was not there to warn them. Now he treated miners with broken bones and traders with infected wounds. Simple work. Safe work. Work that did not require him to make life or death decisions anymore. The other species on the station gave him space. Humans were death worlders. Everyone knew that. But Alan looked too tired and worn to be dangerous. They paid him in credits or food or sometimes just gratitude, and he asked no questions about where they came from or what they were running from. The storm outside grew worse. Alan heard the crash of cargo containers being thrown across the landing bay and the emergency sirens wailing their warnings. He moved to close the shutters on his windows when something slammed against his clinic door. Not the wind. Something alive. Alan grabbed the medical scanner from his desk and moved to the door carefully. Pirates sometimes use storms as cover for raids. Corporate mercenaries sometimes came looking for refugees to collect bounties. He had learned to be cautious in his years on the station. But when he opened the door, he found something he had not expected. A child lay collapsed on his doorstep. Small and thin, covered in purple scales that had lost their shine from malnutrition. The species was Draconari, one of the weakest races in the galaxy despite their fearsome appearance. Their bones were fragile like bird skeletons, and they needed specific atmospheric conditions to survive. This one was young, maybe equivalent to a human 10-year-old, and he was barely breathing. Alan pulled the child inside quickly and laid him on the examination table. The boy's eyes fluttered open, revealing vertical pupils that struggled to focus. His small clawed hands clutched a piece of torn plastic that had crude markings drawn on it. "A map, please," the boy whispered in broken galactic common, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Please save my brother." Alan felt something twist in his chest. The same feeling he had not allowed himself to feel in 5 years. The feeling that maybe he could still save someone. He pushed it down and focused on the immediate problem. The boy was dehydrated, malnourished, and covered in bruises that suggested he had been living rough for weeks or months. "Where is your brother?" Alan asked, already pulling out 4 supplies and nutrient packs. The boy thrust the plastic map toward him with shaking hands. "Tunnels below station. He is dying. Please, you're a doctor. You can save him." Alan looked at the crude map. The abandoned mining tunnels beneath the station were a maze of collapsed passages and toxic gases. They had been sealed off years ago after 3 workers died from sulfur exposure. No one went down there anymore. It was a death trap. "Your brother is in the tunnels?" Alan asked. "Why? Where are your parents?" The boy's eyes filled with tears. "Dead. Station riot. 6 months ago. We hide in tunnels. Safe from hunters. But Rowan is hurt. 3 days now. He is dying." Alan understood immediately. Draconari children were valuable. Their regenerative cells could be harvested and sold to medical research facilities across the galaxy. Orphans disappeared from stations like this all the time, taken by corporations or criminal syndicates. These 2 boys had been hiding underground to avoid that fate. "I cannot move him," the boy continued, his voice breaking. "He is too hurt. But you are human. You can do things others cannot. Please." Alan wanted to say no. Wanted to explain that he was not that kind of doctor anymore. That he had left the hero work behind after it cost him everything. That going into those tunnels was suicide for a human. That he could not save everyone no matter how much they begged. But the boy was looking at him with complete trust. the same way young soldiers had looked at him during the war, believing he could pull off miracles with nothing but a medkit and determination. The same soldiers he had failed. "What is your name?" Alan asked quietly. "Fiend. My brother is Rowan. He is 15 cycles. He protected me from scavengers 4 days ago. They hurt him bad." Alan looked at his old military medkit hanging on the wall. He had not opened it in 3 years. The whiskey bottle on his desk suddenly seemed like a coward's choice. Maybe he had been choosing cowardice for 5 years now. Maybe this terrified child was offering him something he thought he had lost forever. A chance to be the doctor he used to be. "How long does your brother have?" Alan asked, already knowing he had made his decision. "Hours. Maybe less." Finn tried to sit up, but his legs would not support him. "I will show you the way. Please hurry." Alan grabbed his medkit and threw it over his shoulder. He set up a quick 4-drip for Finn to restore some of his strength, then helped the boy to his feet. Outside, the storm raged on, but Alan barely noticed. His mind was already running through scenarios and medical procedures. Draconari biology was different from human physiology. Their organs were positioned differently, their blood chemistry was complex, and they needed higher sulfur content in their atmosphere to survive. The same sulfur that would poison a human within hours of exposure. Finn led him to a maintenance hatch hidden behind waste recycling units. The tunnel entrance was dark and narrow, descending into the belly of the station where failed mining operations had left behind a network of passages filled with toxic gases and unstable structures. "Are you afraid?" Finn asked, looking up at Alan with those vertical pupils that somehow reminded him of the young medics he had trained during the war. Alan thought about lying. Thought about being the confident hero this child needed. But he had learned that lies did not save lives. Only truth and skill did. "Yes," Alan said simply, "but fear does not matter. Your brother needs help, so we go help him." They descended into the darkness together. The storm above faded into distant thunder as they moved deeper into the abandoned tunnels. Alan's portable light cut through the shadows, revealing walls covered in mineral deposits and air that shimmered with sulfur particles. His throat already burned from breathing it. Finn moved with surprising speed despite his weakness, navigating the maze of passages with the confidence of someone who had lived here for months. They passed collapsed sections and flooded chambers. They climbed over broken mining equipment and squeezed through gaps that made Alan's shoulders scrape against rough stone. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, they reached a small chamber lit by a single emergency glow stick. And there, lying on a makeshift bed of torn cloth and salvage padding, was Rowan that Alan's medical training took over immediately. He could see from across the chamber that the boy was in critical condition. His breathing was shallow and irregular. His scales had turned a dull gray that indicated severe illness, and his chest was compressed at an angle that suggested broken ribs and internal bleeding. Alan knelt beside Rowan and opened his medkit. His scanner confirmed what his eyes had already told him. Crushed ribs, punctured lunge, internal bleeding, severe dehydration, early organ failure, and maybe 2 hours before it would be too late to save him. Finn collapsed beside his brother and took his hand gently. "I brought help," he whispered. "The human doctor came. He will save you." Rowan's eyes opened slightly. They were clouded with pain and fever. But when he saw Alan, something like hope flickered in them. Alan looked at his medkit, then at the dying boy, then at the toxic environment that was already making his vision blur at the edges. This was impossible. He could not perform surgery here, could not move the patient without killing him, could not even breathe properly in this atmosphere. But Finn was looking at him with absolute faith. And somewhere in Alan's chest, beneath all the guilt and fear and exhaustion, his old training whispered to him, "When the impossible is all you have, you make it possible. You adapt. You improvise. You refuse to quit." "All right," Alan said, his voice steady despite everything. "Finn, I need your help. Can you follow my instructions exactly?" The small dragon boy nodded immediately. "Yes. Anything." Alan began pulling equipment from his medkit. "Then let us do the impossible together." Alan's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he assessed Rowan's injuries in the dim glow of the emergency light. The scanner displayed information that would have made most doctors give up immediately. 3 fractured ribs on the left side, one of which had punctured the lower lung. Internal bleeding in the abdominal cavity. Dehydration so severe that the boy's circulatory system was starting to shut down. And underneath it all, the slow progression of tunnel fever, a bacterial infection that thrived in the sulfur-rich environment. "How long has he been like this?" Alan asked, trying to keep his voice calm. His own lungs were already burning from the toxic air, and he could feel the beginning of a headache that signaled sulfur poisoning. 3 days since the injury, Finn answered, his small hands hovering uselessly over his brother. "But he has been getting sicker for weeks. Not enough food. The water here makes us sick sometimes, but we have to drink it." Alan nodded, filing away the information. Chronic malnutrition complicated everything. Rowan's body had no reserves to fight infection or heal injuries. The human doctor pulled out his emergency oxygen mask and took 3 deep breaths of clean air before setting it aside. He would need to ration it carefully. The mask only held 20 minutes of oxygen, and this procedure would take much longer than that. "Finn, listen carefully," Alan said, organizing his supplies on a clean section of floor. "I need you to hold this light steady right here. Do not move it no matter what happens." "Can you do that?" The boy took the portable light with both hands and positioned it exactly where Alan indicated. His hands trembled, but he locked his elbows to keep them steady. "I can do it." "Good." Alan pulled out a medical gel pack and a length of flexible tubing from a supply kit. "I cannot take your brother to the surface. Moving him right now would cause more bleeding and kill him. So I have to stabilize him here. The problem is that Drakenari biology is very different from human biology. Can you still help him?" Finn's voice was small and frightened. Alan looked at the dying boy in front of him and thought about all the impossible situations he had faced during the war. Treating Thorian soldiers whose silicon-based blood required completely different coagulants. Performing emergency surgery on a Kiksari whose organs rearranged themselves when stressed. Learning to adapt human medical techniques to alien physiologies because the alternative was watching patients die. "Yes," Alan said firmly, "but I need to try things that are not in any medical textbook. I need to improvise." He started with the most critical issue, the internal bleeding. Drakenari blood was copper-based instead of iron-based like humans, which meant it carried oxygen differently and clotted through a different mechanism. Alan's standard coagulants would not work, but he had learned during the war that sometimes the old methods were better than the new ones. Alan pulled out a compression bandage and a tube of synthetic polymer gel. He cut the bandage into strips and soaked them in a mixture of the gel and mineral water from his canteen. The gel would harden when exposed to air, creating a temporary seal. If he could get it inside the wound, it might stop the bleeding long enough to repair the damage. "This is going to hurt him," Alan warned Finn. "He might scream or thrash. You need to keep that light steady no matter what." "Understand." Finn's scales rippled with fear, but he nodded. "Understand." Alan used the medical scanner to locate the exact position of the internal bleeding. Then he took a long needle from his surgical kit and attached it to a thin tube. He had used this technique exactly once before on a human patient with a ruptured spleen in a field hospital with no power. It had worked then. It had to work now that he inserted the needle between Rowan's ribs with careful precision, guided by the scanner readings. The boy's eyes flew open and he made a choking sound of pain, but he was too weak to move much. Alan pushed the polymer-soaked bandage strips through the tube, feeding them directly into the site of the bleeding. The gel made contact with the wound and began to harden immediately, creating a makeshift internal bandage. Rowan gasped and his back arched, but Finn kept the light perfectly steady, tears streaming down his scaled face as he watched his brother suffer. "Almost done," Alan murmured, more to himself than to Finn. He withdrew the needle carefully and sealed the entry point with more gel. The scanner showed the bleeding had slowed significantly. Not stopped completely, but enough that Rowan would not die in the next few minutes that Alan's head spun from lack of oxygen. He grabbed his mask and took another 3 breaths before setting it aside again. 17 minutes left. He had to work faster. The next problem was the collapsed lung. Drakenari respiratory systems worked differently from humans. They had 2 lungs like humans, but also had a series of smaller air sacs throughout their chest cavity that helped them process the sulfur compounds they needed to survive. The punctured lung had deflated, but the air sacs were compensating enough to keep Rowan alive. Barely. Alan could not repair the lung here, but he could reinflate it temporarily and buy time for the tissue to begin healing. He pulled out a small manual pump from his kit, the kind used to inflate pressure suits in emergency situations. He attached a thin tube to it and sterilized the tube with antiseptic gel. "Hold his shoulder down," Alan instructed Finn. Gently but firmly. Finn moved to his brother's shoulder, pressing down with his small hands. Alan inserted the tube between Rowan's ribs at a different angle, threading it carefully into the chest cavity. Then he began to pump air slowly into the collapsed lung, watching the scanner to make sure it inflated evenly. Rowan's breathing eased almost immediately as the lung expanded. His color improved slightly, the gray scales regaining a hint of their natural purple. But his eyes remained closed and his body was still too hot with fever. Alan pulled out his 4 supplies next. Rowan needed fluids desperately, but standard saline solution would not work for Drakenari physiology. Their cellular chemistry required different mineral balances. Alan looked at the tunnel water that Finn and Rowan had been drinking. It was contaminated with bacteria, but it also had high concentrations of the minerals that Drakenari needed. He made a decision that would have horrified his medical instructors. He took a sample of the tunnel water and ran it through a portable filter to remove the largest bacteria and particulates. Then he mixed it with sterile saline and a broad-spectrum antibiotic from his kit. The result was a makeshift 4 solution that was probably still contaminated, but was better than nothing. Alan found a vein in Rowan's arm and inserted the 4 line. The solution began dripping into the boy's bloodstream immediately. It was not perfect. It might even cause complications later. But right now, later was better than never. His oxygen mask showed 12 minutes remaining. Alan's vision was getting blurry and his hands had started to shake from the sulfur exposure. He took another few breaths from a mask and kept working. The fever was the next battle. Tunnel fever was caused by bacteria that loved sulfur-rich environments. Human antibiotics sometimes worked on it, but not always. Alan injected Rowan with a cocktail of 3 different antibiotics, hoping that at least one would be effective. Then he used cold packs from his kit to bring down the boy's temperature manually. Finn watched everything with wide eyes, still holding the light exactly where Alan had positioned it. The small dragon boy had not complained once, had not asked for breaks or explanations. He simply trusted that the human knew what he was doing. Alan wished he felt that confident. Every decision he made was a guess based on incomplete knowledge and desperation. He was combining techniques from a dozen different medical traditions, human and alien, modern and ancient. He was doing exactly what he had done during the war, the improvisation that had saved hundreds of lives, but had also haunted him with the ones he could not save. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, Alan sat back and checked his scanner one more time. Rowan's vital signs had stabilized. Not good, but stable. The internal bleeding had stopped. The lung was inflated. The 4 was delivering fluids and antibiotics. The fever was dropping slowly. It was not a cure. It was barely even proper medicine, but it was enough to keep Rowan alive. Alan's oxygen mask beeped a warning. 5 minutes remaining. He took the last few breaths and then set it aside, knowing he would need to get out of the tunnels soon or face serious poisoning himself. Is he going to live? Finn asked quietly, finally allowing himself to lower the light. Alan looked at the unconscious boy. For now, yes, but he needs real medical care. He needs to be in my clinic with proper equipment and clean air. These tunnels are killing both of you slowly, even without injuries. We cannot go to the surface, Finn said, his voice thick with despair. The hunters will find us. The station security will take us. We will be separated and sold. Not if I have anything to say about it, Alan said, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. He had not felt this kind of protective anger in years. These were children, orphans who had been forced to live in toxic tunnels because the galaxy's legal systems treated them as property instead of people. Finn looked at Alan with those vertical pupils that seemed to see right through him. Others have promised to help before. They always change their minds when they learn how much money we are worth. Alan understood the boy's skepticism. Trust was a luxury that refugees could not afford. But he also knew that words meant nothing. Only actions mattered. I do not break my promises to patients, Alan said. And you are both my patients now. So here is what we're going to do. I'm going to get your brother stable enough to move. Then we're going to take him to my clinic through the maintenance corridors where security does not patrol. And then we're going to figure out how to keep you both safe. What? Finn asked, the question simple and devastating. Why would you risk everything for us? We are nobody. We have nothing to give you. Alan thought about his medical team, dead because he had not been fast enough. He thought about 5 years of hiding from his own conscience. He thought about all the ways he had failed to be the doctor he had sworn to become. Because a long time ago, I made a promise to help people who needed it, Alan said quietly. And I have been breaking that promise for 5 years. I think it is time I started keeping it again. Finn's eyes filled with tears, and he threw his arms around Alan in a sudden embrace. The human doctor stiffened in surprise, then slowly put one hand on the boy's scaled back. The gesture felt foreign after so long, keeping everyone at a distance, but also felt right. Thank you, Finn whispered. Thank you for saving my brother. Alan gently pulled away and started packing his medical supplies. His head pounded from sulfur poisoning, and his lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. But his hands were steady and his mind was clear. He had a patient to move and a promise to keep. Come on, he said, helping Finn construct a makeshift stretcher from support beams in his jacket. We have a long climb ahead of us, and I want to be out of these tunnels before I pass out from the air. Together, they lifted Rowan onto the stretcher. The boy was still unconscious, but his breathing was stronger. They began the long journey back through the tunnels toward the surface, toward safety, toward a future that neither of them could predict, but both of them desperately needed. The climb back through the tunnels was harder than the descent. Alan's muscles screamed with every step as he carried the front end of the stretcher while Finn struggled with the back. Rowan's weight was not much. The Drakenari boy was dangerously thin, but the awkward angle and narrow passages made every meter a battle. Alan's lungs burned worse with each breath. The sulfur poisoning was getting serious now. His vision kept blurring at the edges, and his balance was unreliable. Twice he stumbled and nearly dropped the stretcher before catching himself. But he refused to stop. Stopping meant dying down here in the dark. And he had not saved Rowan just to let all 3 of them suffocate in abandoned mining tunnels. There is a faster way, Finn said after they had been climbing for 20 minutes. Through the old ventilation shaft. But it is very narrow. Show me, Alan managed to say through gritted teeth. Finn led them to a branching passage that Alan had missed on the way down. The ventilation shaft was a vertical tube, barely wide enough for an adult human to fit through. Metal rungs were bolted to one side, forming a ladder that disappeared upward into darkness. I cannot carry him up that, Alan said, studying the shaft with growing dread. I can climb ahead and pull from the top, Finn offered. You push from below. Rowan is not heavy. It was a terrible plan. It was also their only option. Alan's portable light showed that they were still 3 levels below the station's main sections. The horizontal tunnels would take another hour to navigate, and Alan was not sure he had another hour in him. All right, he said, but we secure him first. Alan used the last of his medical tape and some torn strips from his shirt to strap Rowan to his own back. The boy's unconscious weight pressed against him awkwardly, but it freed Alan's hands to climb. Finn went up first, his small claws finding purchase on the rungs easily despite his weakness. Alan started climbing. Each rung was agony. His arms shook with exhaustion, and his head spun from lack of clean oxygen. Below him, the darkness seemed to pull at his feet. Above him, Finn's small form disappeared into the shadows. And on his back, Rowan's shallow breathing reminded Alan why he had to keep moving. Halfway up, Alan's hand slipped. For one terrifying moment, he hung by his other hand, feet scrambling for the rungs while Rowan's weight threatened to pull them both into the darkness below. Then his boot found metal, and he hauled himself upward with a desperate surge of strength he did not know he still had. Almost there, Finn called down. 10 more meters. Alan climbed. His vision had narrowed to just the next rung, the next breath, the next impossible meter. He climbed because stopping was not an option. He climbed because 2 children were depending on him. He climbed because somewhere beneath the exhaustion and pain, his old training was screaming that medics did not quit while patients still needed them. Finally, his hand reached up and found empty air instead of another rung. Finn's claws gripped his wrist and helped pull him over the edge into a wider maintenance corridor. Alan collapsed on the metal floor, gasping for air that was only slightly less toxic than the tunnels below. "We are in the lower maintenance level," Finn said, his voice tight with worry. "But we have to keep moving. The station workers come through here sometimes." Alan forced himself to sit up and check on Rowan. The boy was still breathing, still stable. The makeshift 4-bag was nearly empty, but the antibiotics were in his system now. They just needed to reach the clinic. Just another few hundred meters. "Help me get him back on the stretcher," Alan said. They transferred Rowan carefully and started moving through the maintenance corridors. These passages were better lit than the tunnels, with emergency lights every 20 meters and signs indicating directions to different station sections. But they were also patrolled. Alan could hear voices and footsteps echoing through the metal halls that Finn's ears perked up suddenly. "Hide," he hissed. They ducked into a storage alcove just as 3 station workers rounded the corner. The workers were deep in conversation about the storm damage and did not look in their direction. Alan held his breath until they passed. Then he and Finn continued moving. They made it 2 more levels up before their luck ran out. Well, a harsh voice said from behind them. "What do we have here?" Alan turned slowly, keeping himself between the voice and the stretcher. 3 figures blocked the corridor. Bounty hunters, based on their mismatched armor and the weapons hanging from their belts. The leader was a frail, a reptilian species known for their lack of empathy and their love of credits. "Just a doctor taking a patient to my clinic," Alan said evenly. The frail's eyes fixed on Finn, who had pressed himself against the wall in terror. "That is a Draconari juvenile. Unregistered, I would bet. Do you know what they are worth?" "I know they are children who need medical care," Alan replied. The other 2 hunters, both human, spread out to flank him. One of them laughed. "Old man, you look like you can barely stand. Just step aside, and we will make this quick. We will even cut you in for 10% if you cooperate." Alan's mind raced. He was exhausted, poisoned, and unarmed. The hunters were fresh and equipped. This should have been an impossible situation. But Alan had spent 5 years in war zones doing impossible things. And he had learned that sometimes the best weapon was knowledge. "Last chance," the Krell said, reaching for Finn. Alan moved. Not like a soldier, because he had never been a soldier. He moved like a combat medic who had studied anatomy across 100 species and knew exactly where every vulnerable point was located. He stepped inside the Krell's reach and drove his fist into the neural cluster at the base of the creature's skull. The Krell's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. Unconscious but alive. Alan had calculated the force precisely. The first human hunter swung at him. Alan ducked under the punch and grabbed the man's arm, hyperextending the elbow joint until it locked. The hunter screamed and dropped to his knees. A precise kick to the side of his head put him down. The third hunter, smarter than his companions, pulled a shock stick and lunged. Alan sidestepped and grabbed a hanging cable from the wall, swinging it like a whip. The cable wrapped around the shock stick, and Alan yanked hard, pulling the hunter off balance. The man stumbled into an exposed electrical conduit, and the resulting shock threw him across the corridor. Silence fell. The entire fight had taken less than 15 seconds. Alan stood over the 3 unconscious hunters, breathing hard. His hands were shaking violently now, and his vision was going gray at the edges. The brief surge of adrenaline had used up reserves he did not have. Finn stared at him with wide eyes. "You are not just a doctor. I was a combat medic," Alan said, his voice rough. We learned to fight because we had to protect our patients when no one else could. He checked each hunter quickly. Alive, just unconscious and injured. They would wake up in an hour or so with headaches and some bruises. Alan felt no guilt. They had been willing to kidnap children for profit. They deserved worse than he had given them. We need to move before they wake up, Alan said, returning to the stretcher, but the fight had cost him. His legs barely supported his weight, and his coordination was failing. The sulfur poisoning had reached critical levels. He managed another 50 meters before his knees buckled and he went down hard on the metal floor. No, Finn said desperately. Please get up. We are so close. Alan tried. He genuinely tried, but his body would not obey anymore. 5 years of neglect and tonight's toxic exposure had pushed him past his limits. He could feel consciousness slipping away. Finn, he managed to say. My clinic. Level 7, Section C. Find Mrs. Okoye. Human woman. She will help. I am not leaving you, Finn said, his small hands trying to lift Alan's arm. You have to, Alan said, forcing the words out. Rowan needs proper care. Go. Now. He must have passed out then because the next thing he knew, he was being lifted by strong hands. His vision cleared enough to see a human woman's face above him, lined with age but strong with determination. Mrs. Okoye. How'd she found them? Finn came and got me, she said, somehow understanding his unspoken question. Smart boy. Now shut up and let me get you to your clinic before you die of stupidity. Alan tried to protest, but his mouth would not work. He felt himself being carried, heard Finn's voice giving directions, smelled the cleaner air of the upper levels. Then he was being laid on a medical bed and an oxygen mask was pressed over his face. The pure oxygen hit his system like a drug. His vision sharpened and the pain in his lungs eased slightly. He was in his own clinic. Mrs. Okoye was setting up a detox for the sulfur poisoning. And Finn was standing guard over Rowan's stretcher like a small dragon warrior. The boys, Alan managed to say through the mask, already treating them. Mrs. Okoye said briskly, the older one needs surgery, but he is stable for now. The little one is dehydrated and scared but tough. Now you focus on breathing and let me work. Alan wanted to help, wanted to take over the treatment, but his body had finally had enough. He felt consciousness slipping away again, but this time without fear. They had made it, against all odds, through toxic tunnels and bounty hunters and his own failing body. They had made it to safety. Darkness took him. Alan's last thought was that maybe he had not lost the ability to save people after all. Maybe he had just forgotten how to try. When he woke, the clinic was quiet except for the soft beep of monitors. Night had fallen outside. He could tell from the darkness beyond his windows. His body ached everywhere, but his head was clear. The detox treatment had worked. Alan sat up carefully and saw Mrs. Okoye sleeping in a chair near the door, a wrench in her lap like a weapon. Finn was curled up on a cot next to a medical bed where Rowan lay sleeping, his chest rising and falling steadily. Both boys looked cleaner, their scales had been washed, and they were hooked up to proper IVs. Alan checked the monitors. Rowan's vitals were improving. Not out of danger yet, but better. Much better. Alan felt a weight lift from his chest that he had been carrying for 5 years. He had done it. He had saved them. Then he heard voices outside his clinic door. Official voices. Security voices. Mrs. Okoye's eyes snapped open and she gripped the wrench tighter. They have been out there for an hour, she said quietly, waiting for you to wake up. They want the boys. Alan looked at Finn and Rowan, these 2 children who had survived so much already. Then he looked at his clinic door, knowing that behind it waited people who would separate them, process them, sell them to the highest bidder. He stood up on shaky legs and walked to the door. Mrs. Okoye tried to stop him, but he shook his head. I will handle this, he said. He opened the door to find Officer Delane and 3 security personnel waiting in the corridor. Delane was a Centaurian, a species known for following regulations to the letter. His multiple eyes regarded Alan with professional coldness. Dr. Reeves, Delane said formally, we have reports of 2 unregistered Draconari juveniles on the station. We also have 3 injured bounty hunters filing assault charges against you. Alan stepped out into the corridor and closed the door behind him, putting himself between security and his patients. "Those are my patients in there," he said quietly, "and they're not going anywhere. Station law requires all unregistered aliens to be processed and documented," Dulane replied. "The juveniles are flagged as research property. They are children, not property. The law disagrees. Please step aside." Alan did not move. He was exhausted, poisoned, barely able to stand. Dulane had 3 armed officers with him and the full weight of station authority. This was a fight Alan could not win, but he had learned something tonight in those dark tunnels. Sometimes winning was not about force or authority. Sometimes it was just about refusing to back down. "No," Alan said simply. Dulane's eyes narrowed. "Do not make this difficult, Doctor. I am making this very simple," Alan replied. "These are my patients. You will have to go through me to take them." The 2 men stood facing each other in the corridor, and in the quiet space between them, the entire station seemed to hold its breath. The corridor outside Alan's clinic had become a stage, and neither man was willing to step down. Officer Dulane stood with his security team, representing the law and order of Frontier Station 7. Alan stood alone, representing nothing but his refusal to abandon 2 children who had no one else. Behind Alan, the clinic door remained closed. Inside, he knew Mrs. Okoye would be preparing for the worst, probably arming herself with whatever medical instruments could serve as weapons. Finn would be terrified, watching through the window, believing that this human who had promised to protect them was about to fail like all the others. "Dr. Reeves," Dulane said, his tone shifting from official to something more personal. "I understand your feelings here, but the boys are flagged in the system. A genetics research corporation called Biogen Holdings has legal documentation claiming ownership. They filed the claim 6 months ago after the parents died." "Ownership," Alan repeated, the word tasting like poison. "You mean they filed paperwork to buy children?" "The legal terminology is guardianship transfer for research purposes," one of the security officers said. "The parents signed the documents before their deaths." Alan's jaw clenched. The parents were killed in a station riot. I doubt they had much choice about what they signed. Dulane shifted uncomfortably. His multiple eyes could not quite meet Alan's gaze. "That may be true, but station law requires me to enforce valid documentation. The corporation has a legal claim. I have to process the juveniles and transfer them to corporate custody. And then what happens to them?" Alan demanded. "They get separated? Locked in research facilities? Harvested for their cells until there is nothing left of them?" "That is not my jurisdiction," Dulane said, but his voice lacked conviction that a crowd had begun to gather in the corridor. News traveled fast on a small station, and the sight of security confronting the human doctor was too interesting to ignore. Station residents pressed against the walls, watching and whispering. Alan recognized many of them. The Thorian miner whose daughter he had treated for reactor fever. The Kiksari trader whose difficult birth he had coached through over-emergency comms. The human maintenance worker whose broken arm he had set without charging a fee. "Dr. Reeves," Dulane tried again. "Please be reasonable. I do not want to arrest you, but I will if you force me to. Step aside and let us do our jobs." Alan looked at the crowd, then back at Dulane. An idea was forming, born from desperation and the memory of how human legal systems worked. It was a long shot. It would probably fail, but it was better than just surrendering. Under the Earth Accords, Section 17, Subsection 4, Alan said clearly, loud enough for the crowd to hear, a licensed medical professional has the right to refuse surrender of any patient in critical condition until that patient is stabilized. Dulane's eyes widened slightly. That law applies to human patients and human doctors in human space. It applies to licensed doctors treating any patient, Alan countered. The law does not specify species. It was written after the Geneva Conventions to prevent medical personnel from being forced to abandon patients during conflicts. "This is not a conflict zone," the security officer said. "No," Alan agreed. "But it is my clinic, and those boys are my patients, and one of them is still in critical condition from chest trauma and infection. I am invoking my right to continue treatment." Delane hesitated. The law was obscure, written centuries ago for situations that rarely occurred anymore. But it was still technically on the books, part of the tangled web of regulations that govern multi-species stations. If Alan was right, and if Delane chose to enforce it, the security officer could delay taking the boys until they were medically cleared. Even if I accept that argument, Delane said slowly, it only delays the inevitable. Once they are stable, the law requires me to process them. Then I will keep them unstable, Alan said flatly. I will find new complications, new treatments that require monitoring. I can keep them in critical condition for weeks if I have to. The security officer bristled. That will be malpractice. That will be proper medical care for patients with complex conditions. Alan shot back. Are you a doctor? Do you want to make that diagnosis yourself? The crowd was growing larger. More whispers. More interested faces. Alan could feel the mood shifting, could sense that public opinion might be on his side. Station residents had no love for corporate claims or security overreach. They had even less love for the trafficking of children, legal or not. Then a voice cut through the tension. Small and frightened, but determined. Please, Finn said. The clinic door had opened. Finn stood in the doorway, his small frame trembling, but his eyes clear. Mrs. Okoye stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder, ready to pull him back if needed. Please do not take us, Finn continued, speaking directly to Officer Delane. My brother and I have no one. Our parents were killed 6 months ago in the lower sectors. We saw them die. We hid in the tunnels because people kept trying to catch us. They said we were valuable. They said our cells could make medicine. But we are not medicine. We are just children. Delane's expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy. The crowd fell silent, listening. We lived in the dark for 6 months, Finn said, his voice breaking. We ate garbage. We drank water that made us sick. Rowan protected me from people who wanted to hurt us. He got injured saving me from scavengers. And when I thought he was going to die, I found Dr. Reeves. Tears were streaming down Finn's scaled face now, but he kept talking. The human did not have to help us. He could have turned us away. He could have called security himself. But he went into the poisoned tunnels even though it hurt him. He saved my brother with almost nothing. He carried us through the dark. He fought people who wanted to take us. And now you want to give us to the same corporation that has been hunting us for months. Several people in the crowd made sounds of sympathy. A few were crying themselves. The Thorian miner stepped forward. The human treated my daughter, he said in his rumbling voice. She was dying from radiation exposure. He saved her life and refused payment. He said doctors do not charge desperate people. The Kiksari trader spoke up next. He talked me through a birth when my ship was stranded in deep space. 3 hours over the comms, teaching me how to deliver my own child safely. He never asked for anything in return. More voices joined. Story after story of Alan helping station residents without question or compensation. The human maintenance worker, a Silixian merchant, a young human couple. People Alan had almost forgotten treating because it had just been his job, the thing he did because he was a doctor. Officer Delane looked increasingly uncomfortable. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were becoming participants, their presence a silent statement that taking these children would not be accepted quietly. This is all very touching, the security officer tried to say. But the law is the law. We have our orders. Then your law is broken, Alan said, throwing the officer's earlier words back at him. And I do not follow broken laws. Delane's hand moved to his weapon, then stopped. He looked at the crowd, at the 2 dragon children, at the exhausted human doctor who could barely stand but refused to back down. His multiple eyes blinked in sequence, a centaurian gesture of deep thought. I need to call this into my superior, Delane said finally. That will take time. At least 3 hours for a response, given the communication delays from the storm interference. He looked directly at Alan, and something passed between them. An understanding. If you and your patients were to go back inside that clinic, Delane continued carefully, I would not be able to stop you until I receive my orders. I certainly could not be expected to break down the door of a medical facility without proper authorization. Alan understood. Delane was giving them time. Not much, but something. 3 hours, Alan said. At least, Delane confirmed. Possibly more if the storm interference continues. The security officers started to protest, but Delane silenced him with a gesture. The crowd began to disperse slowly, though several people lingered, clearly intending to keep watch. The thorium miner positioned himself against the wall opposite the clinic door, arms crossed, a living statement that getting to those children would require going through him first. Alan helped Finn back into the clinic and closed the door. His legs were shaking from exhaustion and stress. Mrs. Okoye caught his arm and guided him to a chair. "That bought us some time," she said, "but not much. You know they will come back with proper authorization and probably more security." "I know," Alan said. He looked at Rowan, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the battle being fought over his future. Then at Finn, who had collapsed into a chair and was crying quietly into his hands. "We need a plan," Mrs. Okoye continued. "A real one. Because 3 hours from now, they're going to take these boys unless we can give them a legal reason not to." Alan's mind raced despite his exhaustion. She was right. Delane had given them a gift of time, but time alone would not save Finn and Rowan. They needed something stronger than a doctor's moral stance. They needed a legal argument that even the corporations could not fight. The Earth Accords, Alan said slowly. They were written to protect refugees during the Unification War. Children specifically. There are provisions for emergency guardianship by qualified individuals when parents are deceased and the children are at risk. You want to file for guardianship. Mrs. Okoye looked skeptical. That will take weeks to process, and the corporation's claim is already established. Not if we argue that the original claim was obtained under duress, Alan said, his thoughts coming faster now. The parents died in a riot. Any documents they signed in the weeks before their death could be challenged as coerced. If we can prove the corporation was pressuring them, the claim becomes invalid. And how do we prove that in 3 hours? Alan looked at Finn. Did your parents ever mention the corporation? Did they ever talk about being pressured to sign papers? Finn wiped his eyes and nodded slowly. They were afraid. People came to our home. They said we were valuable. They said our family would be taken care of if they signed the guardianship transfer. But my parents refused. Then the riot happened and they died. Do you think the corporation caused the riot? Mrs. Okoye asked. I do not know, Finn said, but it was convenient for them. My parents died, and suddenly the paperwork showed they had signed, but I never saw them sign anything. Alan felt a cold anger settling in his chest. It was a familiar feeling from the war, the controlled fury that came when he saw injustice done to people who could not fight back. We need evidence, he said. Records, witnesses, anything that shows the corporation's history of coercing families. I might be able to help with that, Mrs. Okoye said. She pulled out a small communicator. I have contacts in the Refugee Protection Council. They have been tracking Biogen holdings for years. If anyone has evidence, they do. She stepped away to make the call, while Alan moved to check on Rowan. The boy's vitals were improving steadily. The antibiotics were working, and his body was finally getting the nutrients it needed. In a few days, with proper care, he would be healthy again, if they had a few days. If the corporation did not take him first. Finn appeared at Alan's elbow, looking up at him with those vertical pupils that had learned to see threats everywhere. Do you really think you can stop them? Finn asked quietly. Alan wanted to promise success, wanted to tell this child that everything would be fine. But he had learned during the war that false promises were crueler than hard truths. I do not know, he said honestly, but I promise you this. I will fight for you and your brother with everything I have, and I do not quit easily. Finn nodded slowly, accepting the truth for what it was. Then he did something that surprised Alan. He took the human's hand and held it tightly. Thank you for trying, Finn said. Even if we lose, thank you for being the first person who tried. Alan squeezed the small clawed hand gently, feeling the fragile bones beneath the scales. These children had been through hell and still had the capacity for gratitude. They deserved better than what the galaxy had given them. Mrs. Okoye returned, her expression grim but determined. I made contact. The Refugee Council has records on Biogen holdings. Multiple families pressured into signing guardianship transfers. 3 cases where parents died under suspicious circumstances shortly after refusing to sign. And they have been trying to build a legal case for months, but needed a specific incident to challenge. This could be that incident, Alan said. It could be, Mrs. Okoye agreed. But we need to file the paperwork immediately, and we need to make enough noise that the corporation cannot just make the boys disappear. We need publicity, attention, witnesses. Alan looked around his small clinic at the 2 dragon children who had come to him for help, at the old nurse who had appeared when needed, at the growing crowd of station residents outside his door who had decided to stand with him. Maybe he could not save everyone. Maybe his decisions 5 years ago had cost lives. But right now, in this moment, he had a chance to save 2 children from a fate worse than death. And he had learned something in those dark tunnels beneath the station. Sometimes the impossible just required refusing to accept any other option. Then let us make some noise, Alan said. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of activity that transformed Alan's small clinic into a war room. Mrs. Okoye worked her communicator like a weapon, contacting everyone she knew in the Refugee Protection Council and several galactic news networks. Alan pulled up legal databases and started drafting guardianship paperwork with shaking hands. And Finn, despite his exhaustion, began organizing his drawings into a timeline that documented everything his family had endured. The storm outside had finally broken, which meant communication channels were clearing. That was both good and bad. Good because they could reach allies. Bad because the corporation could reach their legal teams and security forces. We have interest from 3 news outlets, Mrs. Okoye announced. 2 human networks and 1 multi-species independent station. They want live feeds if this turns into a confrontation. Good, Alan said without looking up from his legal forms. The more eyes on this, the harder it will be for Biogen to just make the boys disappear. He was working from memory and desperation, trying to remember the guardianship laws he had studied decades ago during his medical training. The Earth Accords had provisions for emergency custody, but they required proof of imminent danger to the children and a qualified guardian willing to take responsibility. Danger was easy to prove. Biogen's history spoke for itself. But qualified guardian was trickier. Alan had resources, his military pension and savings could support 2 children. He had skills, medical training that would ensure they receive proper care. But he also had a record of isolation and a clinic in the worst part of Forgotten Station. Would that be enough? The Refugee Council is sending a legal representative, Mrs. Okoye said, reading from her communicator. She's on a fast transport and will arrive in 90 minutes. Her name is Advocate Priya Singh, human, specialized in protecting alien refugees from corporate exploitation. Alan felt a small surge of hope. A real lawyer would know how to navigate the legal maze better than he could. But 90 minutes was cutting it close. Dulane's 3 hours would be up soon, and once his superiors gave the order, the security officer would have no choice but to act. Finn looked up from his drawings, which he had spread across a medical table in chronological order. Will the advocate really help us? We cannot pay her. The Refugee Council works for free, Mrs. Okoye explained gently. They're funded by donations and grants. Helping children like you is what they do. Rowan stirred in his bed, consciousness returning slowly. His eyes opened and focused on Finn with obvious relief. Then he saw Alan and Mrs. Okoye, and confusion crossed his scaled features. Where are we? Rowan asked, his voice rough from disuse. Finn rushed to his brother's side and took his hand. The human doctor's clinic. You're safe. He saved you. Rowan tried to sit up, but Alan gently pushed him back down. Easy. You had surgery. Internal injuries. You need to rest. Surgery. Rowan's eyes widened. In the tunnels? Improvised field medicine, Alan said. Not pretty, but it worked. How do you feel? Like I was hit by a cargo hauler, Rowan said, but he managed a weak smile. But alive. Thank you. The gratitude in his voice made Alan uncomfortable. He had only done what any doctor should do, but he nodded and checked Rowan's vitals on the monitor. Everything was improving. The boy would make a full recovery, given time. Tom might not have ... Mrs. Okoye's communicator chimed urgently. She answered, and her expression grew grim. That was my contact at station security. Biogen's legal team just arrived. They're meeting with Delane now, and they brought corporate security with them. 6 armed mercenaries with legal authorization to use force if necessary. How long do we have? Alan asked. Minutes, maybe? Delane is stalling as much as he can, but his hands are tied. The corporation has all the proper documentation. Alan looked at the 2 boys. Finn was holding Rowan's hand tightly, both of them watching the adults with eyes that had learned not to hope for too much. They had been abandoned by every system that should have protected them. Parents dead, government indifferent, laws treating them as property. And now they were betting everything on a washed-up doctor and an old nurse in a forgotten clinic. We need to buy more time until the advocate arrives, Alan said. Ideas. Barricade the door. Mrs. Okoye suggested. They will just cut through it or use the ventilation system. Create a medical emergency that requires quarantine. They will bring their own doctors to verify. They were running out of options. Alan's mind raced through scenarios, each one ending with armed mercenaries breaking down his door and dragging 2 terrified children away. There had to be something he was missing, some angle he had not considered. Then Finn spoke up. What if we tell everyone what is happening? Not just the news networks. Everyone on the station. What do you mean? Alan asked. The station has public address systems, Finn said. Emergency broadcasts. If people knew what was happening, if they understood what the corporation wants to do to us, maybe they would help. Mrs. Okoye shook her head. Station residents are not going to stand against corporate mercenaries. It is too dangerous. They already stood against security earlier, Finn pointed out. They listened to my story. They cared. Alan looked at the boy with new respect. Finn was right. The crowd outside his clinic had not dispersed entirely. The Thorian miner was still there, along with a handful of others who had decided that this mattered enough to stay. Station residents had no power individually, but together they were the station. And stations ran on cooperation, not force. It is worth a try, Alan said. He moved to his clinic's communication panel and accessed the station-wide emergency broadcast channel. Technically, this was illegal without proper authorization. But he had already committed to fighting broken laws, that he keyed the microphone and spoke clearly. This is Dr. Alan Reeves in Clinic 7C. I am broadcasting an emergency situation that all station residents need to hear. Across Frontier Station 7, speakers crackled to life. In the docking bays, in the residential sections, in the shops and bars and maintenance corridors, people stopped what they were doing and listened. 6 months ago, 2 Drakenari children lost their parents in a riot, Alan continued. They spent half a year hiding in the abandoned tunnels beneath our station, living in poison air and eating garbage because they were afraid. Afraid of a corporation called Biogen Holdings that wanted to take them, separate them, and harvest their bodies for research. He paused, letting that sink in. 4 hours ago, the younger brother came to my clinic and begged me to save his dying sibling. I went into those tunnels. I performed emergency surgery with almost no equipment. I brought both boys back here and gave them medical care that probably saved their lives. Another pause. Now corporate mercenaries are outside my door with legal papers saying these children are property. They want to take them away. They want to do to them what they have done to dozens of other refugee children. And according to station law, they have every right to do so. Alan could hear movement in the corridors outside. Footsteps approaching. Voices raised. The mercenaries were coming. I'm not asking you to break laws, Alan said into the microphone. I'm asking you to witness what is about to happen. Come to Clinic 7C. Bring your recording devices. Let the galaxy see what we allow to be done in the name of legal documentation. Let them see us choose corporate profits over the lives of children. He released the microphone and looked at Mrs. Okoye. She was smiling grimly. That was either brilliant or suicidal, she said. Possibly both, Alan admitted. They did not have to wait long. Within 5 minutes, the corridor outside Alan's clinic had filled with station residents. Dozens of them, then hundreds. They came from every section, every species, carrying portable recording devices and standing shoulder to shoulder until there was no space left to move. The corporate mercenaries arrived to find themselves facing a wall of witnesses. Their leader, a human woman in expensive tactical armor, looked at the crowd with obvious frustration. "Clear this corridor," she ordered. "We have legal authorization to retrieve corporate property." No one moved. Officer Dillane appeared, looking harried and overwhelmed. "Dr. Reeves, you cannot just hijack the emergency broadcast system. That is a serious violation." "Add it to my list," Alan called through his clinic door. Right after the assault charges from the bounty hunters, the mercenary leader pushed forward through the crowd, which parted reluctantly. She reached Alan's door and pounded on it with an armored fist. "Dr. Reeves, I am Lieutenant Shaw, head of security for Biogen Holdings. We have legal documentation granting us custody of 2 Draconari juveniles currently in your care. You have 60 seconds to open this door and release them, or we will breach the door by force." "I am invoking medical sanctuary," Alan called back. "One of my patients is in critical condition following major surgery. Moving him could cause fatal complications. We have our own medical team. They will assess the patient. I do not recognize the authority of corporate doctors to overrule my medical judgment in my own clinic." Lieutenant Shaw's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Sir, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. But either way, we are leaving with those children." The crowd had begun recording. Dozens of devices pointed at the mercenaries, capturing every word and action. Alan could see the lieutenant's jaw clench as she realized they were being documented from every angle. "You have no legal standing to refuse," Shaw said, trying a different approach. "The children are flagged as corporate property following a valid guardianship transfer. Station law requires you to comply." "The guardianship transfer was obtained under duress," Alan countered. "The parents were coerced into signing documents shortly before their deaths. I am challenging the validity of your claim and filing for emergency custody under the Earth Accords. That will take weeks to resolve. Then I guess you will have to wait weeks." Shaw made a gesture, and 2 of her mercenaries moved forward with a door-breaching tool. The crowd pressed closer, recording devices focusing on the mercenaries' every move. This was going to turn ugly fast. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "I would not do that if I were you." Everyone turned to see a small human woman pushing through the crowd. She was wearing a formal suit despite the station's casual environment, and she carried a briefcase that marked her as legal profession. Advocate Priya Singh had arrived early. "Who are you?" Shaw demanded. Advocate Priya Singh, representing the Refugee Protection Council and, as of 2 minutes ago, Dr. Alan Reeves and his clients Finn and Rowan. She pulled out a legal pad and displayed an official document. "I have just filed an emergency injunction challenging Biogen's custody claim on the grounds of fraudulent documentation and endangerment of minors. Until the challenge is resolved, you have no legal authority to remove those children." Shaw's expression darkened. "That injunction is not valid. It has not been reviewed by a judge yet. It was filed with the Galactic Family Court 10 minutes ago and transmitted to this station's legal database 30 seconds ago," Priya said calmly. "Check your own systems if you do not believe me." One of Shaw's team checked a portable terminal and nodded confirmation. The lieutenant's face went red with anger. "This is a delay tactic. The court will deny it." "Perhaps," Priya agreed. "Or perhaps they will review the evidence we have gathered showing Biogen's pattern of coercing refugee families, falsifying guardianship documents, and causing suspicious deaths among parents who refuse to cooperate. Evidence that includes testimony from 4 other families and documentation of payoffs to station officials who look the other way." She held up her briefcase. "Would you like to see? I have copies for the court, for the press, and for every law enforcement agency in 3 sectors." The corridor had gone silent. Every recording device was focused on Lieutenant Shaw, waiting to see how she would respond. The mercenary leader looked at Priya, at the crowd, at the wall of witnesses recording her every word. "This is not over," Shaw said finally. "Biogen will fight this injunction." "I welcome it," Priya replied. "I've been trying to get Biogen into a courtroom for 2 years. Thank you for finally giving me the opportunity. Shaw and her team withdrew, pushing through the crowd with barely controlled anger. Officer Dillane watched them go, then turned to Alan's clinic door. Dr. Reeves, he said formally, please open up. We need to have a conversation. Alan opened the door cautiously. Dillane stepped inside along with Advocate Singh, but he left his security team outside. The Centaurian looked tired. You just made my job incredibly complicated, Dillane said. I apologize for that, Alan said, meaning it. You tried to help us earlier. I know you were taking a risk. Dillane waved off the apology. The boys can stay here pending the court's decision on the injunction. But understand this will not be resolved quickly. Biogen has resources. They will fight. Let them fight, Priya said confidently. She looked at Finn and Rowan, who were watching from the medical bed with wide eyes. These boys have been fighting alone for 6 months. Now they have lawyers, witnesses, and a very angry doctor on their side. Biogen might have resources, but we have something more powerful. What is that? Finn asked quietly. Priya smiled. We have a truth. And once people see the truth, they cannot unsee it. The hearing took place 3 weeks later in the station's largest conference room, hastily converted into a makeshift courtroom. Every seat was filled with station residents, news media, and representatives from a dozen different advocacy groups. The Galactic Family Court had assigned an arbiter to hear the case remotely. Her holographic form projected above the main table with the grave dignity of her Silixian species. Alan sat at one table with Advocate Priya Singh and the 2 boys. Finn looked terrified in clothes that Mrs. Okiye had bought for him, while Rowan, still recovering but much stronger, kept a protective arm around his younger brother. Across the aisle, Biogen's legal team occupied the other table with 3 lawyers in expensive suits and an air of supreme confidence. The arbiter's name was Sela, and her multifaceted eyes regarded both parties with the cold logic that Silixians were famous for. This did not bode well. Silixians valued law and order above emotion. They made decisions based on documentation and precedent, not moral appeals. This hearing will determine the validity of Biogen Holdings' custody claim over juveniles designated as Finn and Rowan, Arbiter Sela stated. Biogen, present your case. The lead corporate lawyer stood. His name was Richard Cross, and he had the smooth confidence of someone who had never lost a case. He activated a display showing legal documents with official seals and signatures. The case is quite simple, Cross began. 6 months ago, the parents of these juveniles signed a legal guardianship transfer agreement, granting Biogen Holdings custody for research purposes. The parents were compensated fairly. The documents are legitimate, and station law recognizes such transfers as binding. The juveniles are therefore corporate property, and this entire hearing is a waste of the court's time. He projected images of the signed documents. As you can see, both parents signed willingly. We have timestamps, verification codes, and witness signatures. Everything was done according to galactic legal standards. Priya stood to respond. The documents appear legitimate, yes, but they were signed under duress. The parents were threatened, coerced, and ultimately killed when they tried to back out of the agreement. That is a serious accusation, Cross said smoothly. Do you have proof? I have something better, Priya replied. I have a pattern. She activated her own display, showing a list of names and cases. In the past 3 years, Biogen has filed 16 guardianship transfer claims for Drakenari juveniles. In 12 of those cases, the parents died within weeks of signing the documents. In 3 cases, the parents disappeared entirely. And in every single case, the families were living in poverty on remote stations where oversight is minimal. The room erupted in murmurs. Cross's expression remained calm, but his jaw tightened slightly. Correlation is not causation, Cross argued. Drakenari refugees live dangerous lives. Their mortality rate is unfortunately high. You cannot prove Biogen was responsible for any of those deaths. No, Priya agreed. But I can prove a pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable families. I can show that Biogen specifically seeks out refugees with no legal protection or community support. And I can demonstrate that the guardianship transfer documents are always signed shortly before convenient tragedies occur. She pulled up another file. This is testimony from a former Biogen employee who worked in their acquisition department. She describes a quota system where recruiters were paid bonuses for obtaining custody of Drakenari children, with larger bonuses for families that could be pressured into signing quickly. Cross objected immediately. That testimony is hearsay from a disgruntled former employee. It has no legal weight. Arbiter Sela raised a hand for silence. I will review all evidence presented. Continue. Priya nodded and turned to Finn. I would like to call my first witness. Finn, please tell the arbiter what you remember about the days before your parents died. Finn stood on shaky legs, looking small and vulnerable in the formal setting. But when he spoke, his voice was clear. Men came to our home, Finn said, 3 times in 2 weeks. They told my parents that we were valuable, that our cells could help sick people. They said if my parents signed papers, our family would be taken care of. We would have money and safety. What did your parents say? Priya prompted. They said no. They said we were children, not medicine. The men got angry. They said refusing was dangerous. That accidents happen on stations like this. The room was completely silent now, every eye on the small dragon boy. Then the riot happened. Finn continued, his voice breaking. My parents told us to hide. They went to help stop the fighting. We never saw them alive again. And after they died, the station security said they had signed papers giving us to Biogen, but I never saw them sign anything. They promised they would never let anyone take us. Cross stood quickly. This is emotional testimony from a traumatized child. It proves nothing about the validity of the documents. It proves motive, Priya countered. It establishes that the parents were threatened and that they refused to cooperate. It creates reasonable doubt about whether those signatures were genuine or whether they were forged after the parents' convenient deaths. She projected another image. This is a forensic analysis of the guardianship documents. The signatures match the parents' handwriting, yes, but the digital timestamp shows they were signed 4 hours after station security logged the parents as deceased. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Cross's confident expression finally cracked. That is impossible, he said. The timestamp must be corrupted. 3 independent forensic experts have verified it, Priya said calmly. Would you like to see their reports? Arbiter Sela leaned forward, her multifaceted eyes focusing intently on the documents. This is indeed troubling. Biogen, how do you explain this discrepancy? Cross shuffled through his papers, clearly caught off guard. There must be an error in the station's record-keeping. Perhaps the deaths were logged incorrectly, or perhaps the documents were forged, Priya suggested. Perhaps Biogen has been falsifying guardianship transfers to acquire Drakenari children illegally, then hiding behind legal technicalities when challenged. That is defamatory, Cross sputtered. It is the truth, Priya said simply. Alan watched the exchange with growing hope. Priya was dismantling Biogen's case piece by piece, using their own documentation against them. But he knew corporate lawyers were skilled at recovery. Cross would find some technicality, some legal loophole to keep fighting. Then Rowan stood up, surprising everyone. He was not supposed to testify. He was still weak from his injuries. But the older dragon boy looked at the arbiter with steady eyes. May I speak? Rowan asked. Arbiter Sela considered, then nodded. Briefly. I remember the men who came to our home, Rowan said. One of them had a scar on his face. He told my father that refusing to sign would be bad for our health. My father reported it to station security, but they said there was nothing they could do. 3 days later, the riot started in our section. My father said it was not a coincidence. He said someone wanted chaos so they could finish what they started. Did your parents tell you this directly? Arbiter Sela asked. Yes. The night before they died, my father told me to protect Finn no matter what happened. He said powerful people wanted us and that we had to disappear if anything happened to them. He made me promise to keep my brother safe. Rowan's voice strengthened. I kept that promise. I protected Finn in the tunnels for 6 months. I got hurt defending him from people who wanted to sell us. And when I was dying, Finn found the only person on this station who cared more about saving lives than making profit. Dr. Reeves had no reason to help us. He risked his life going into poison air to perform surgery with almost no equipment. He fought bounty hunters while suffering from toxic exposure. He stood against armed mercenaries to keep us safe. He looked directly at the Arbiter. Biogen says we are property. They say paperwork gives them the right to take us. But Dr. Reeves says we are patients, that we are children who deserve protection. I do not understand all these laws and documents, but I understand the difference between people who see us as valuable cells and people who see us as lives worth saving. Please do not give us to people who only value what they can take from our bodies. The room was completely silent when Rowan finished. Even Cross seemed at a loss for words. Alan felt his throat tighten with emotion. This boy had been through hell and still had the courage to stand up for himself and his brother. Arbiter Sela studied Rowan for a long moment. You are quite articulate for someone who has had no formal education in galactic legal systems. I am articulate for someone who has spent 6 months fighting to survive, Rowan corrected gently. You learn to speak clearly when your life depends on it. A ghost of something that might have been approval crossed the Arbiter's features. She turned her attention to the documents displayed before her. Biogen, she said formally. Your documentation appears to have significant irregularities. The timestamp discrepancy alone is grounds for questioning the validity of these signatures. Combined with the testimony of the juveniles and the pattern of suspicious deaths surrounding your other acquisitions, I'm inclined to rule that your custody claim is invalid. Cross stood quickly. Arbiter, I must protest. Even if these specific documents are questionable, Biogen has invested significant resources in the expectation of acquiring these juveniles. We have futures contracts, research protocols already developed, facility space allocated. Denying our claim will cost the company millions of credits. Are you arguing that financial investment grants you ownership rights over children? Arbiter Sela asked, her tone dangerously neutral. I am arguing that the law must consider all parties' interests, not just emotional appeals from refugees who have no legal standing. The juveniles have legal standing through their appointed advocate, Arbiter Sela corrected. And the law exists to protect the vulnerable, not to legitimize exploitation disguised as legal procedure. She looked at Alan. Dr. Reeves, you have filed for emergency guardianship. Do you understand the responsibilities this entails? Alan stood. Ido arbiter. You would be financially responsible for 2 juveniles of species not your own. You would need to provide housing, education, medical care, and support until they reach legal majority. You will be subject to regular inspections and oversight. Are you prepared for this commitment? I am, Alan said firmly. Why? The Arbiter asked. You have no prior connection to these children. You could simply walk away and let the system handle them. Why make yourself responsible? Alan thought about his answer carefully. He could talk about duty or morality or his medical oath. But the truth was simpler than that. Because Finn came to my door and asked me to save his brother, Alan said quietly. And I did. And in saving them, I remembered something I had forgotten. That being a doctor is not about following procedures or avoiding risk. It is about helping people who have no one else. These boys have no one else. So I will be what they need. Arbiter Sela regarded him with those multifaceted eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. Selixians were logical, rational, supposed to value law over emotion. But they were also one of the oldest species in the galaxy, and their laws had survived because they knew when to bend. This arbiter finds the following, Sela announced formally. Biogen Holdings' custody claim is invalid due to fraudulent documentation and evidence of coercion. The guardianship transfer is void. Emergency custody is granted to Dr. Alan Reeves pending formal guardianship approval, which will be expedited given the circumstances. Biogen is ordered to cease all contact with the juveniles and is referred to galactic law enforcement for investigation into their acquisition practices. The room erupted. Reporters rushed to file stories. Station residents cheered. Cross and his legal team looked like they had been struck by lightning. And Finn launched himself at Alan, wrapping his small arms around the human's waist and crying with relief. Alan held the boy gently, while Rowan stood and bowed slightly to the arbiter in a gesture of profound respect. Mrs. Okoye was wiping tears from her eyes, and Priya was already fielding questions from advocacy groups who wanted to use this case as precedent for challenging other corporate custody claims. Cross gathered his materials with barely controlled fury. "We will appeal this decision," he said to Priya. "Biogen has resources you cannot imagine." "Go ahead and appeal," Priya replied calmly. "Every day you fight this case, more evidence comes out about your company's practices. Every hearing brings more attention to what you do to refugee families. By the time you finish appealing, Biogen will be facing criminal charges in a dozen systems." Cross left without another word, his team following. The corporate mercenaries who had been waiting outside simply departed, their contract apparently not worth the fight anymore. Officer Delane approached Alan with something like respect in his multiple eyes. "Congratulations, Doctor. You just took on 2 children and picked a fight with one of the most powerful corporations in this sector." "I have picked worse fights with worse odds," Alan said tiredly. "At least this time I won." The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork and interviews. Alan signed formal guardianship documents. Priya explained the oversight process and what inspections to expect. Mrs. Okoye had already prepared a list of things the boys would need, from proper beds to educational materials. Finally, as evening fell over Frontier Station 7, Alan found himself back in his clinic with Finn and Rowan. The boys sat on medical cots, looking exhausted but peaceful for the first time since he had met them. "What happens now?" Finn asked. "Now we figure out how to be a family," Alan said. "I have never had children before. You have never had a human guardian. So we will all be learning together. Will we stay here?" Rowan gestured at the clinic. "This is your work. This is too small for 3 people," Alan admitted. "We will need to find proper housing. Maybe something in the residential sector with more space. And we can go to school." Finn's eyes lit up with hope. "Yes, and you can learn whatever you want. Medicine, engineering, art, anything." The boys looked at each other, communicating in the silent way siblings do when they have only had each other for too long. Then Rowan spoke. "Thank you for fighting for us. You could have turned us away that first night. No one would have blamed you." "I would have blamed me," Alan said simply that a communication chime interrupted them. Alan answered to find a military channel requesting connection. His old unit commander appeared on the screen, a grizzled human woman named General West. "Alan," she said, her scarred face showing surprise and something like pride. "I saw the news coverage. Looks like you're making headlines again." "General," Alan said, equally surprised. "I did not think the military monitored refugee custody hearings." "We do not usually," West admitted. "But when one of our decorated combat medics takes on a major corporation to protect alien children, people notice. Your old team wanted me to tell you something." She pulled up a file showing photos of the medical team that had died in the field hospital explosion. The faces Alan had been haunted by for 5 years. "We reviewed the incident reports from that day," Wes said gently. "We found something you did not know. The blast was not random. It was a targeted strike. Intelligence suggests the enemy knew our field hospital location and hit it specifically. You survived because you stepped out to grab supplies, yes. But if you had been there, you would have died too. You could not have saved them, Alan. No one could have." Alan felt something break inside his chest. 5 years of guilt, of believing he had failed them, of thinking he had been too slow or too cautious. And now learning it had never been his fault at all. "They wanted you to know something else," Wes continued. "The techniques you developed during the war, the improvised cross-species medicine protocols, they have saved thousands of lives since. We teach your methods in military medical training now. You did not fail your team, Alan. You honored them by becoming the doctor they trained you to be." The screen went dark. Alan stood in silence, feeling years of weight lifting from his shoulders. Finn and Rowan watched him with concern. "Are you all right?" Finn asked quietly. Alan looked at the 2 boys who had come into his life and forced him to remember who he was supposed to be, who he could still be. "Yes," he said, and meant it completely. "I'm better than I've been in a long time." 6 months later, Alan stood in the doorway of their new home in the residential sector. It was not large, but it had 3 bedrooms and a small common area where they could share meals. Finn was at the table doing homework from his new school, his tongue sticking out in concentration. Rowan was helping Mrs. Okoye, who visited often, prepare dinner in the small kitchen. The clinic was still running, but Alan had hired an assistant to help manage the workload. He had discovered that being a parent required time and attention he had not needed to budget before. But he did not mind. The work was different now, filled with school meetings and homework help and teaching 2 alien children about human culture while learning about their culture in return that a news alert on his tablet caught his attention. Biogen Holdings had been indicted on 17 counts of fraud and exploitation. 3 executives had been arrested, and the Refugee Protection Council had successfully challenged 12 other custody claims using the precedent Alan's case had set. "Dad," Finn called from the table. "Can you help me with this math problem?" "Dad." The word still felt strange, but Alan was getting used to it. He moved to the table and looked at Finn's homework, explaining the solution in simple terms. Rowan joined them, offering his own interpretation of the problem. Together they worked through it, 3 minds approaching it from different angles until Finn understood. This was what family looked like, Alan realized. Not perfect, not what anyone would have planned, but real and messy and more valuable than anything he had known before. The journalist had asked him, weeks ago, why he had risked everything for 2 alien children he did not know. His answer had been simple then and remained simple now. A child asked me to save his brother. What else could I do? The galaxy had thousands of species with different values and different morals. But Alan had learned something during that desperate night in the tunnels beneath Frontier Station 7. Some things transcended species boundaries. Compassion, protection of the vulnerable, the refusal to let injustice stand unopposed. Those were not human values. They were just values. And they were worth fighting for. That Rowan scales had regained their healthy purple shine. Finn was laughing at something Mrs. Okoye said. The clinic would open again tomorrow, and there would be more patients who needed help. More refugees who needed someone to care when no one else would. Alan smiled and returned to the table where his family was waiting. He had spent 5 years trying to hide from his purpose. But 2 small dragon boys had found him anyway and reminded him of something essential. Sometimes the unbelievable was just the result of refusing to accept any other option. Sometimes saving lives was as simple as answering when someone asked for help, and sometimes family was not about blood or species. It was about showing up when it mattered and refusing to quit even when everything seemed impossible. Alan Reeves had learned to do impossible things in dark tunnels with no equipment and toxic air. Raising 2 alien children and building a real family would be easy by comparison. Or at least, he thought with a smile as Finn and Rowan started arguing about whose turn it was to clean their room. It would be interesting. And after 5 years of trying to forget who he was, interesting was exactly what he needed.